It was just before sunrise when the gates were opened. No horns sounded. No soldiers formed ranks. No arrows were prepared. The wooden doors of Xicheng creaked outward slowly, like a mouth opening in surrender, or in defiance. A thin mist drifted across the stone walls, softening the edges of the fortress until it looked less like a stronghold and more like a ghost. The air was still. No footsteps, no commands, no signs of life. And beyond that silence, an army was coming. Tens of thousands of soldiers under Sima Yi advanced steadily across the plains. Their armor clinked in rhythm, their banners cut through the fog, their presence stretched across the horizon like a dark tide that could not be stopped. Inside the fortress, nothing. No formations, no defenses, no resistance, just open gates. And at the top of the wall, seated calmly in plain sight, was a single man, Zhuge Liang. He did not shout orders. He did not prepare for battle. He played music. The soft notes of a guqin drifted down into the empty courtyard, delicate and steady, as if the world beyond the walls did not exist, as if an army of overwhelming force was not about to swallow everything in its path. Because this was not a mistake. This was not surrender. This was a gamble. A decision so dangerous that it erased the line between genius and madness. If the enemy attacked, the fortress would fall in minutes. The man on the wall would die where he sat, and the state he served would lose one of its greatest minds. But if the enemy hesitated, if doubt could be planted even for a moment, then fear itself would become a weapon. This was not a battle of swords or arrows. This was a battle of perception. And on that silent morning, history stood on the edge of something unprecedented. An empty fortress against one of the strongest armies in the world. The moment at Xicheng did not emerge from nowhere. It was born in an age of fragmentation, ambition, and relentless war, the Three Kingdoms period. Three rival states, Wei, Shu, and Wu, fought for dominance over a fractured China. Alliances shifted, borders burned. Victory was never permanent, and survival often depended on decisions made in moments of extreme pressure. Among these states, Shu was the weakest. It lacked the vast manpower of Wei. It lacked the economic strength of its rivals. What it possessed instead was strategy. And at the center of that strategy stood Zhuge Liang. He was not introduced through titles or ceremony, but through action, through precision, through calm decisions made under impossible conditions. He moved armies like pieces on a board, not through brute force, but through timing, positioning, and understanding the mind of his enemy. Across the battlefield, there was a man who understood him, Sima Yi, a general of Wei, cautious where others were aggressive, patient where others rushed. He had survived not by chance, but by refusing to underestimate his opponents. And among all enemies, there was one he respected most, Zhuge Liang. This mutual awareness would shape everything that followed. At the time of the empty fort incident, Zhuge Liang found himself in a position that bordered on disaster. His forces were stretched thin across multiple fronts. His supply lines were fragile. And at Xicheng, the situation was worse than anyone outside the walls could imagine. There were almost no soldiers, no hidden reserves, no defensive strength. What remained inside the fortress was barely enough to maintain order, let alone withstand an assault. And advancing toward this empty stronghold was Sima Yi, leading a force that dwarfed anything Zhuge Liang could muster. The imbalance was not subtle, it was absolute. If battle occurred, the outcome was already decided. The fortress would fall, Zhuge Liang would die, and with him, the fragile strategic balance that kept Shu alive might collapse entirely. The stakes were not limited to a single location. They expanded outward, layer by layer. Personal survival, military stability, the future of an entire state. And beyond that, something deeper, the evolution of warfare itself. Because until that moment, Battles were decided by strength, positioning, and numbers. But here, in this narrow window of time, another possibility began to take shape. One where fear could outweigh force. One where hesitation could defeat certainty. One where the strongest army in the field could be stopped, without a single blow. But before that could happen, the dread had to be real. And it was. The Wei army did not rush. It advanced methodically, its presence growing heavier with each passing hour. Dust rose beneath thousands of feet. The sound of movement carried across the land like distant thunder. Even before the soldiers appeared in full view, their approach could be felt. Inside Xicheng, the silence was not calm. It was pressure. Every empty space echoed with the same question. What happens when they arrive? There were no speeches, no declarations, no last stands prepared. Only a decision waiting to be made. And when it came, it would change everything. Continuing with Acts 2-5 in the structure you specified, the fortress of Xicheng was never meant to become the stage for a miracle. It sat in rough country, exposed enough to be seen from a distance, enclosed enough to seem defensible from the outside, but vulnerable in the one way that mattered most. If a real army came with real intent, it could not hold. Its walls were respectable, its gates thick, its towers high enough to command a view of the approaches. But stone alone is never a defense. Men are the defense. Supplies are the defense. Numbers are the defense. And Zhuge Liang had almost none of them. That was the first fact. The second was worse. Sima Yi was not an impulsive butcher charging toward glory. He was a commander who looked twice, then a third time, who mistrusted what seemed easy, who believed that the most dangerous battlefield was often the one that appeared already won. Against most generals, that caution was a limitation. Against Zhuge Liang, it became the center of the contest. Because Zhuge Liang did not need to defeat Sima Yi's army in the field, he only needed to defeat his certainty. The ground around Xicheng mattered for that reason. The approaches were visible from the walls. Dust clouds could be read. Movement could be measured. The fortress sat where a commander on the ramparts might appear to know more than the army below. Distance would become theater. Height would become authority. Silence would become evidence. To a reckless enemy, an empty fortress was an invitation. To a careful one, it was a warning. Inside the fortress, the reality was harsh. There were not enough soldiers to stage resistance in depth. There were not enough archers to line the walls convincingly. There were not enough reserves to create the illusion of a hidden strike force waiting in ambush behind the gates. If Sima Yi attacked at once with confidence, the deception would break in an instant. The walls would be scaled or battered. The gates would fall. Zhuge Liang would be dragged from the parapet or cut down where he sat. The state of Shu would lose not merely a commander, but its mind. That was the material truth. But war is never only material. It is also ritual, expectation, memory. And Sima Yi carried memory like a blade. He knew the name of Zhuge Liang. He knew the pattern of his campaigns, the manner in which he turned weakness into disguise and delay into advantage. He knew that where other men made noise, Zhuge Liang made calculations. Where others staged panic, Zhuge Liang staged composure. That knowledge, earned through long war, would now be used against him. There would be no frantic preparation inside Xicheng, no shouts, no false drumming, no visible panic. The plan was too delicate for noise. Instead, Zhuge Liang chose something colder. He would prepare not for battle, but for performance. He ordered the gates opened, not cracked, not loosened, opened. The command itself must have sounded impossible to those few around him. In the language of war, gates are meaning. Closed gates say resistance. Broken gates say defeat. Open gates say madness or trap. He was choosing the third option because it was the only one that gave him any chance at all. He ordered the streets cleaned. Men in plain clothes, or soldiers disguised as common laborers, moved with brooms through the dust. Their task was not defense. Their task was atmosphere. Nothing invites suspicion like visible fear. Nothing sharpens suspicion faster than calm where panic should exist. A fortress expecting battle would reinforce its walls. A fortress expecting defeat would close its gates. But a fortress unconcerned by either? That was another matter. That was wrong. And wrong things make careful men stop. The preparation of weapons was almost irrelevant because the strategy did not depend on using them. Yet the few soldiers who remained still checked what arms they had. Spears were straightened. Swords were tightened in their scabbards. Bows were set within reach, not because they would save the fortress, but because men cling to ritual when they stand near annihilation. Fingers moved over wood, leather, and bronze. The touch of familiar tools steadied the pulse, if only for a moment. Somewhere, a soldier swallowed against a dry throat and tasted fear, bitter, metallic, old as war itself. But they were not preparing to fight. They were preparing to be seen. Or, more precisely, preparing not to be seen. No crowded walls, no banners, no urgent movement. Every instinct had to be crushed under discipline. Men who had survived battle by reacting quickly now had to survive by doing nothing. That was its own kind of courage, harsher in some ways than a charge. To stand idle while the enemy approached, to trust that stillness could preserve life, required a form of obedience bordering on faith. And faith was present, though not in grand ceremony. This was ancient war. Prayers did not always need words. Some men looked toward the sky. Some tightened cords around wrists or armor clasps like private charms. Some thought of home. Some thought of graves. Some thought only of the coming sound of boots and whether their commander had finally crossed the line between genius and ruin. Night, in the versions that tell the story with greater drama, hangs over the decision like a second curtain. If we follow the spirit of those accounts, then somewhere before dawn, Zhuge Liang must have sat with the shape of the plan already fixed in his mind, listening to the fortress breathe. The soft scrape of straw sandals on stone, the dry whisper of brooms, the far-off murmur of men who knew too much and understood too little. He would not have needed long speeches. He would not have needed to reassure everyone. What reassurance could exist? He had chosen a road with only two endings, survival through terror or death through certainty. The Guqin was prepared. That detail matters because it was not decoration. It was the hinge of the illusion. A man screaming commands on the wall would have betrayed strain. A man surrounded by visible guards would have betrayed need. But a man seated openly, hands steady, drawing music from strings while an enemy army approached? That suggested hidden power. It implied knowledge invisible to the observer. It said, with unbearable calm, "I know something you do not." That message was the weapon. No catapult could throw it. No spear could pierce with it. But it could move through distance, through fog, through the mind of a cautious commander. It could infect judgment. By dawn, everything was arranged. The gates stood open. The sweepers moved. The walls remained bare. The instrument waited. And Zhuge Liang took his place above the empty fortress, not like a besieged commander, but like a host awaiting guests. Below him, the road stretched toward the horizon, and on that road came Wei. The morning light strengthened slowly, revealing first dust, then shapes, then ranks. Armor caught the sun in broken flashes, standards rippled, horses stamped, metal rang against metal. The army of Sima Yi advanced with the heavy confidence of power accumulated over years of victory and discipline. It should have been a simple approach to an easy seizure, but simplicity is often what the intelligent distrust most. The sound reached the fortress before the first faces could be seen clearly. Hooves beating the earth, axles groaning, leather tightening, the dull, layered percussion of thousands of men moving in one intention. It was the sound of inevitability. But inside Xicheng, no answering sound rose to meet it. No alarm, no drum, no shouted order, only the faint beginning of strings. The first clash of the empty fort strategy was not steel on steel. It was expectation against silence. As Sima Yi's forward elements came into full view of Xicheng, the fortress should have answered them with the familiar language of war. Closed gates, armed parapets, nervous motion on the walls, smoke from hurried fires, messengers running. Somewhere, always, signs of human strain. But there was none. The gates stood open, wide open. A few figures swept the ground near the entrance as if they had all the time in the world, their movements slow, unhurried, almost insulting in their ordinariness. No lines of defenders presented themselves. No archers peered over the battlements. No stones were stacked for dropping. No boiling oil. No visible command post. And above this impossible calm sat Zhuge Liang, robes composed, posture straight, fingers touching the strings of the guqin with the controlled precision of a man at leisure. A lesser commander might have laughed. A braver commander might have charged. Sima Yi did neither. His army slowed, then slowed again. Dust drifted around the front ranks. Horses tossed their heads. Officers looked from wall to gate to commander and back again. Men who had expected to hear an order to advance instead received the most dangerous thing an army can receive in motion: pause. That pause spread backward through the formation like a tremor. It was not fear yet, not fully. It was confusion in armor. The sort of confusion that makes men look twice at an easy prize and wonder where the knife is hidden. This was the first phase, approach, and the breaking of expectation. Sima Yi studied the fortress. He knew what he was seeing, but he did not believe it. That difference saved Xicheng. Because reality said the fortress was exposed. Reality said the gates were undefended. Reality said a direct attack would shatter the place. But memory stood beside him, whispering another truth. Zhuge Liang did not make careless gestures. Zhuge Liang did not expose weakness openly. Zhuge Liang, above all men, understood deception. If he sat there calmly in plain view while Wei approached, then perhaps the openness was the disguise. That was the second phase, suspicion. And suspicion is stronger than momentum. Sima Yi watched the sweepers, too calm. He watched the walls, too empty. He watched Zhuge Liang, too composed. The music drifted downward, faint but unmistakable, the notes clear in the morning air. They were not triumphant. They were not desperate. They were measured, controlled. They moved across the open space between fortress and army like a thread being drawn slowly through flesh. Not loud, not dramatic. Worse than that, certain. The men of Wei heard it too. An army does not need language to feel that something is wrong. Soldiers sense irregularity in the body before they can explain it in words. They know the difference between an abandoned place and a waiting place. Xicheng felt like waiting. But if there were an ambush, where was it? That question sharpened and deepened. Eyes searched the surrounding ground, the ridges beyond the walls, the brush, the folds of the land. Officers pointed, scouts muttered. Distance turned every patch of shadow into possible concealment. Every hillock became a place where hidden archers might lie flat. Every grove a screen for cavalry. Every still gate a mouth with teeth just inside. Sima Yi had not survived by dismissing such doubts. He had survived by obeying them. Hours in battle are often marked by blood. Here they were marked by imagination. The army waited. The fortress did not react. That was the third phase, psychological escalation. The air grew warmer as the sun climbed. Sweat gathered beneath helmets. Leather stuck to skin. Men stood in formation and felt the weight of stillness settle over them. The smell of horse, dust, and iron thickened. Somewhere a harness jingled sharply, and the sudden sound seemed louder than it should have been. The taste of uncertainty dried the mouth. A breeze moved through the open gate and carried no scent of cooking, no clamor of panic, no whisper of preparation, only emptiness. But emptiness itself can be a signal. And that was the brilliance of Zhuge Liang's position. If the fortress had shown some defense, Sima Yi might have judged it honestly. If it had shown fear, he might have pressed it once. But it showed neither. It showed serenity where serenity made no sense. It created a contradiction so clean that only two answers seemed possible: madness or confidence born of hidden force. Sima Yi did not believe in madness from that man, so he leaned toward hidden force. This was not irrational. It was the product of long war. He knew Zhuge Liang's habit of seeing farther than other commanders, of turning terrain, rumor, and timing into multipliers of strength. If there were troops concealed nearby and Wei advanced carelessly into the gate, the front of the army could become trapped in a narrow killing zone while attacks fell from both flanks. Disorder at the front might ripple backward. Horses would turn, infantry would bunch, command would fray. A strong army could be damaged badly in a space so small if the surprise was real. But there was a cost to caution too. Every minute he hesitated, he allowed the possibility that there was in fact no ambush and that the fortress truly was naked. Every minute he delayed, victory, if it was victory, sat a little farther beyond reach. This was the struggle inside the mind of the commander, not between courage and cowardice, but between risk and doubt. And doubt, once planted, grows roots fast. The officers around him wanted direction. Some likely favored attack. Others, seeing their commander's gaze fixed and unreadable, began to suspect the same hidden danger. That is how armies think, not as one mind, but as many minds tuned to the judgment of one man. If Sima Yi believed danger was present, danger became real enough to affect every posture, every hand on a spear, every horse held a little too tightly at the rein. Zhuge Liang continued to play. There is something terrifying about calm used with precision. The Guqin's notes did not plead for mercy. They did not challenge. They simply existed, each one measured and clean, as though the man producing them had settled the outcome already. That composure struck more deeply than any taunt could have done. If he had laughed, it might have felt theatrical. If he had shouted, it might have sounded forced. But music suggested he had time, and only a protected man has time. By midday, the battlefield still had not broken into violence. This was the silence beat before what should have been the eruption. But the eruption never came. Instead, Sima Yi continued to evaluate. He read the fortress. He reread it. He looked for patterns that would reveal the trick. Yet the trick was not in some concealed movement. It was in him, in what his own caution had made possible, in the weight of Zhuge Liang's reputation pressing against every obvious fact, in the memory of previous campaigns and the refusal to walk straight into a trap set by the most dangerous mind in Shu. The fourth phase had arrived. Decision. A commander in that instant does not merely decide what is before him. He decides what story of danger he believes. Attack and prove the fortress empty, or die in an ambush history will call foolish. Withdraw and preserve the army, or retreat from shadows. Only one choice could be reversed later. If he attacked and the trap were real, the damage might be irreparable. If he withdrew and the trap were false, he would lose only face. One can survive humiliation. One cannot survive annihilation. And so the strongest army on the field began to lose to the one weapon it could not see. At some point the order was given. Withdraw. Not rout. Not panic. Discipline remained. But the line of advance faltered, shifted, and then slowly bent backward away from the fortress. Standards turned. Horses were reined around. Units began to pull away from what, moments earlier, had looked like easy conquest. The men of Wei obeyed. And with that obedience, the battle ended. No arrows had been loosed. No gate rammed. No wall scaled, no shield split, no ranks shattered, no blood soaking the entrance to the city. But make no mistake, this was a battle. A contest fought in the open, under the eyes of two commanders, where one side imposed its will on the other. It was simply fought in a medium rarer than iron: perception. That was the fifth phase: collapse and retreat. Inside Xicheng, the release would not have come at once. Men who had stood frozen in obedience now had to trust that the retreat was real. The sweepers near the gate likely continued their work a little longer than necessary because disbelief clings even after danger passes. The soldiers out of sight, the few who were there at all, must have listened with straining ears as the sounds of the Wei army shifted from approach to departure. Hooves softened, commands receded, metal diminished into distance. Only then could breath return. Only then could the hands that had remained still begin to shake. Some traditions say that once the enemy withdrew, those beside Zhuge Liang finally allowed themselves to speak the fear they had swallowed all morning. Some say they asked how he had dared to do such a thing. Some say he admitted the truth plainly, that there had been no ambush, no reserves, no hidden salvation beyond the one he had forced into being inside Sima Yi's mind. Whether or not those words were spoken exactly that way matters less than the core truth they carry. The fortress had been empty. The threat had been real. The victory had existed entirely in the distance between what was and what the enemy believed might be. This is why the empty fort strategy has endured, not because it celebrates recklessness, but because it reveals something brutal about command. That power is often less decisive than the fear of unseen consequences. Sima Yi did not retreat because he was weak. He retreated because he was intelligent enough to understand how catastrophic underestimating Zhuge Liang could be. That intelligence, admirable in most settings, became the very instrument used against him. And yet, it would be too simple to call this merely a trick. It was more than performance. It was a precise understanding of the opponent. Zhuge Liang did not attempt the stratagem against a fool, because fools often attack what they do not understand. He used it against a cautious mind, one trained to detect hidden danger. The stratagem worked because the target possessed the exact qualities required for the deception to land. Another commander might have stormed the gates and ended the story there, but not this one. That is why the confrontation matters so deeply. It was not just fortress against army, it was mind against mind, reputation against logic, the visible world against the imagined one beneath it. Both men were, in different ways, prisoners of intelligence. One weaponized it, the other obeyed it. By afternoon, the road beyond Xicheng no longer carried the pressure of approach. The dust settled. The sounds of the Wei army thinned into absence. Sunlight lay across the open gate, across the swept ground, across the unchanged stones that should have been taken by force and were not. The Guqin fell silent. And in that silence, the fortress remained standing, not because it had been strong, but because it had convinced strength to turn away. After the army of Wei withdrew, Xicheng did not erupt in celebration. It exhaled. That was the first aftermath. Not triumph, but release. The kind that leaves men weak in the knees, hollow in the chest, and suddenly aware of how close they had stood to obliteration. The gates that had been left open as bait were still open now, but the meaning had changed. Before, they had been a lie designed to invite fear. Now they were simply wood on hinges again, with daylight passing through them onto a city that should have been dead and wasn't. No great tally of corpses marked the field before Xicheng, because the point of the stratagem had been to prevent battle rather than survive it. That absence of carnage is part of what makes the scene so haunting. Battlefields are usually proven by bodies. Here, the proof lay in what had not happened. No shattered shield walls, no piles of dead near the gate, no wounded calling for water beneath the walls. The ground remained almost offensively intact, as if war itself had paused just outside the threshold and then thought better of crossing. If we speak in terms of casualties, then the numbers are strange. dead in the clash, none that tradition can securely name. Wounded by the assault, none in the ordinary sense. But that does not mean the cost was zero. The men inside the fortress had spent hours under a pressure that leaves its own scars. Fear can hollow the body as surely as hunger. Waiting for the charge that never came is still a form of suffering. There is a taste to that sort of survival, sour and metallic. The taste left behind when the body floods itself with dread and then has nowhere to spend it. Even after the danger passed, some would have remained tense, hearing the retreat and yet not trusting it, seeing the road emptying and still expecting the horizon to darken again with returning banners. For Zhuge Liang, the immediate aftermath was likely quieter than the legend later made it. Men at that level of command do not always celebrate their own escape. Often they measure what has been postponed and what remains unresolved. He had preserved the fortress. He had preserved himself. But he had not destroyed Wei, had not broken the larger strategic pressure, had not changed the underlying imbalance of power between the states. He had survived one collapse. He had not ended the war. That distinction matters, because legends love clean endings, and war almost never provides them. The stories that followed would magnify the morning at Xicheng into a near supernatural display of intellect. They would preserve the image of the open gates, the sweepers, the music, the retreat. They would sharpen the contrast because contrast is what memory feeds upon. But even in the most dramatic retelling, the empty field afterward remains the most powerful image. Not because nothing happened there, because everything happened there, inside the invisible realm where command decisions are actually made. A battlefield after slaughter is one kind of emptiness. A battlefield after avoided slaughter is another. The first is full of ruin. The second is full of absence. At Xicheng, absence became the landscape. Open road, open gate, clean ground, high walls without blood on them. A few men still looking outward, perhaps, not fully believing the strongest force in sight had turned away from a fortress it could have crushed by numbers alone. If there was a siege phase in miniature, it existed in those suspended hours between approach and withdrawal, when the fortress lived in the shadow of imminent assault. That tension, drawn out without impact, is why the stratagem has the shape of a siege even without siege engines deployed against the wall. It was a siege of nerve, a siege of expectation, a siege in which the attacker found himself blocked not by stone, but by the possibility that the stone concealed something worse. By evening, the light would have changed across the walls. The heat of noon would have loosened. Dust that had risen under thousands of marching feet would begin to settle over the road, softening the tracks of the retreat. Somewhere inside the city, men who had remained hidden could emerge from their places. Speech would return in fragments first, then in full. Questions, nervous laughter, retellings already beginning while the event itself was still warm. This is how history starts to harden into story, not later, in books, but immediately, in the mouths of those who survived. And at the center of those retellings stood one image above all others, a commander on a wall, playing music to an army that chose not to kill him. The empty fort strategy endured because it answered a question that war never stops asking. What is strength, really? At Xicheng, strength appeared obvious. It marched under banners. It filled the road. It possessed numbers, weapons, and the power to destroy. Weakness seemed just as obvious. It sat behind open gates with almost no means of defense. But the outcome overturned that logic. Immediately, the result was simple. Zhuge Liang survived. The fortress remained in Shu hands, at least for that critical moment. Sima Yi preserved his army, but lost the chance to strike decisively. Neither side vanished. No empire fell that day, but something more subtle entered the tradition of warfare with renewed force. The understanding that reputation, composure, and the manipulation of perception can shape the battlefield as surely as cavalry or siege engines. In the long term, the story became one of the most famous examples of psychological warfare in East Asian military thought. Whether every detail happened exactly as later retellings describe is a separate question. and an important one. The tale is most widely known through the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, where drama and moral pattern often sharpen events beyond what sober record can guarantee. Scholars have long debated how literal the incident was, how much it was embroidered, how much it was shaped to fit the character of Zhuge Liang as the supreme strategist whose mind itself was a fortress. That uncertainty does not weaken the story. It explains why it survived. Because the tale is not remembered merely as a fact claim. It is remembered as a truth claim about war. It expresses, in dramatic form, the idea that human beings do not fight only with weapons. They fight with assumptions. They fight with memory. They fight with terror of what might be waiting just beyond sight. That is the philosophical meaning of Xicheng. Fear defeated strength because strength could not prove that fear was mistaken in time. The open gate became a paradox powerful enough to halt an army. The empty space inside the fortress became more dangerous than a crowded wall would have been. And one commander's unbroken calm became, for a few crucial hours, heavier than thousands of armed men. Centuries later, the story still stands where the soldiers once did. The fortress is no longer waiting. The road no longer carries way banners. The dust has settled beyond memory. But the lesson remains on the stones. In war, the mind is not a separate battlefield. It is the first one. And sometimes, it is the last.